Kia koutou. Kia ora. Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi nui kia koutou, and welcome to the second event in Te Otago University's New Zealand's AI Speakers Forum series. Before we commence our hui today, I'd like to open with a karakia. Whakatakati hau ki te uru, whakatakati hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. He hi aki ana te akatukura. He tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei Māori ora. Ko Giselle Burns takuingoa. I'm the provost at Te Kuninga ki Purihurua Massey University, and I'm honoured to be the chair of today's session. We're very fortunate to have today, colleagues, as our guest speaker, Professor Alistair or Ali Knott. Ali is a Professor of Artificial Intelligence at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. A little bit of background about Ali. He grew up in Brussels, and during his early education and formative years, he developed a fascination for language, which has led to more than 30 years working as an AI and computational linguistics researcher. Ali studied psychology and philosophy at Oxford. He then completed an MSc and a PhD in artificial intelligence at the University of Edinburgh, before moving to Aotearoa, New Zealand. He's worked at the University of Otago for several years in the Department of Computer Science before moving to Te Herenga Waka. An expert on models of human language and its interfaces with perception, motor control and memory, Ali has published more than 100 papers on these various and interconnected topics. And underpinning Ali's research throughout his career is a strong and abiding interest in the ethical and the social implications of artificial intelligence. He co-leads the Global Partnership on AI's project on social media governance and has also contributed to the Christchurch Call's algorithms workstream, as well as participating in various working groups at the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. So very much involved in impact and communication. Professor Knott's also currently involved in a commercial contract with Auckland-based AI company Soul Machines and contributes to their ethics policy, which provides him with a unique set of opportunities for advancing the discussion about AI and its impact on society. Please welcome Professor Knott today. Ali's going to speak to us for about 35 or so minutes, and then we're going to have some time for questions at the end of the presentation. Kia ora, Ali, I'll hand over to you.
Kia ora koutou. Yeah, I'll make sure and leave lots of time to discuss this because it's a useful thing to discuss. Maybe the thing I'll do to start with is just talk about, since I didn't realize until just recently that the people on the call are representing management from many different universities here in New Zealand, all the tertiaries, I think. So to start with, it's worth just noting that there's all sorts of new things on the agenda for AI-related work in universities generally, and that includes New Zealand. So, and that's because AI is everywhere, as you all know, and that's why I'm here talking to you, I guess. So the focus I have in that work on social media governance is thinking about how AI is involved, for instance, in influencing how content is shared around the world, how information travels on the media or on social media and those kind of things. So just to give you a few examples, the things in red are AI systems. So recommender algorithms are the things which provide you with your content feed, for instance, on Facebook or something like that, or decide what advertisements you're going to see, or recommend tunes for you on Spotify, or movies for you, or books on Amazon or something. Those are straight machine learning AI systems. And so we're enormously impacted by those things all the time. Then on social media in particular, since anyone can post whatever they want, there needs to be content moderation. And this kind of impacts on this issue of free speech, which comes up a lot in New Zealand universities just recently. Some of that work has to be done automatically by harmful content classifiers because there's just too much content to do it all manually. So that's another piece of AI that's sort of withholding content from people or choosing to do that. Also incredibly important, and we need to make sure I get it right, And then there's a third aspect, which is generative AI, which is what I'll mostly be talking about today. And that's interesting because it doesn't only kind of manipulate content or disseminate content or withhold it, but also produces new content, human-like content or natural-looking content. So all of those things mean that AI is just all over the place at the moment. And what that means is that universities have some new jobs in this area of AI. It used to be that universities just provided a place where AI researchers like me could do their research. But now we also need to study how AI is being used in this wider world, because it's all over the place and the impacts are very broad. So we have to study what those impacts are, and that can be done by AI researchers, but also by other researchers. Social science is all about that kind of thing, and also advise on how AI should be overseen. And that's certainly not just the preserve of technical AI researchers like me. That's something which needs to involve people in policymaking and law and so on, philosophy, applied ethics, and so on. So all of that stuff, I hope you'll agree, is ridiculously interdisciplinary. And the discussions that I'll be talking about today, I've never been in such interdisciplinary discussions. So I'm from AIs, the technical side originally, but we also need, like I was saying, social science to look at social impacts, and then you need government and law to look at what policies should be in place to control AI or to oversee it. And then the humanities are involved to study the effect of AI on our culture and to make sure and safeguard human culture. So it's a large portion of the university. And if you think of sector-specific things like medicine and things like that, AI is everywhere. So we need new structures, potentially, new interdisciplinary structures for sort of organizing research groupings, but also for forming new students who've got the relevant interdisciplinary experience, for instance, a bit of technical AI, but also some of those other disciplines. So all of that feels like a long-term project that universities can usefully think about and collaborate on. So I'll start off just with a bit of background, just because I'm talking to this university's management group. So I'll start off by talking about the place where I started, which is in New Zealand work, sort of just oversight of New Zealand focused AI. So I first started doing work on usage of AI in the New Zealand government, partly because the government has control over what it does itself, and also there's principles of open government, which mean it's easier to study that stuff than it is to study commercial stuff. So it seemed like a good place to start. So I was at Otago until a couple of years ago, and at Otago, I helped to set up the center down there for AI and public policy, along with a lawyer and an applied ethicist in philosophy. That was in 2018. In 2019, we wrote a report on AI as it's used in government departments in New Zealand, and that was quite influential. It was one of the foundation documents in this thing that later arrived in 2020, an algorithm charter that was one of the very first all-of-government algorithm charters in the world, actually. So New Zealand was quite responsive in this case, and sort of like just indicates that if government, if academics sort of make proposals in this area, the government in New Zealand is quite receptive, or at least responsive. And actually, this process of seeking advice is ongoing. Right now, the government is seeking further advice on AI, especially the generative stuff. And New Zealand universities should be working together to provide that advice, I think. So I'm not sure what the best way of doing that is, but I just put it for this group in particular as something to talk about maybe later. Just one model that happened last year, and actually the report was released this year. There was a report on AI in healthcare that was organized by the government's chief science officer, which was Juliet Gerard back then. She just finished. And that involved advice from many academic AI researchers, but also a broad range of disciplines, as you might expect. And of course, there are lots of people in the medical field too, but it was very much a group effort across the whole of New Zealand. And I think we can learn from that. So internationally, just a bit more context on that as well. So like you heard, I work in this organization called the Global Partnership on AI. So that's an international group of AI experts, basically. So it's from 29 countries there. We're just about to be incorporated into the OECD, so it's probably more like 38 countries or something. So it's an international group, and that's a useful place to do other sorts of work that relate more to, for instance, oversight of big tech companies. So I lead a project on social media governance, which is eminently big tech. And that work looked at 3 types of AI system. And I'll briefly, those are the 3 ones I mentioned before, basically. So recommender systems, those things that kind of push content at you, like in your daily feed, on your news feed, and your recommended friends, recommended ads, and so on. We argue that researchers should be able to use company methods for studying the effects of algorithms on users. And the company methods are basically kind of randomized controlled trials. They try out this version of their algorithm on this random group, this other version on this other random group. And then if there's any difference in the behavior of those 2 groups, by God, you know it's a causal consequence of the difference in the algorithms. So at the moment, external researchers don't have access to that, and companies only use it for their own benefit, basically, and they don't publish their results. So we're arguing strongly for external researchers to be able to use those methods. And we're talking a lot with people inside the EU, which is at the forefront of legislation here. The Digital Services Act governs social media, and there are special rules for large online platforms like social media companies. And the rules for external researchers are being discussed right now, and we're very much involved in those conversations. So harmful content classifiers is another one. In this one, the problem that we identify is that these classifiers are trained behind closed doors in individual companies. And so we don't really know what's going on. And we're sort of looking at ways which we could pull the training set, at least, for these classifiers outside of companies into a sort of semi-public domain, and then have a population in some area be the ones who determine, using democratic methods, a bit like opinion polling, actually, for deciding what items count as harmful or what items are harmful enough to ban. So it's just an idea. We're exploring with this, and we're not advocating anything here. But we're piloting this in India. We have some people in our group from India who are very active on this, and we're working in political hate speech to see if this works, basically. Can you trust the crowd to tell you what counts as hateful and what doesn't? We're exploring that idea. In generative AI, the key thing is that we argue, and we've argued for the last 18 months or so, that we need ways of reliably detecting AI-generated content, and that companies are the ones who should provide those. So that's what I'll talk mainly about today. But I thought I'd just give you an overview of what's happening, like in New Zealand, where New Zealand universities might, profitably do something, and then what's happening internationally. There's various other people in New Zealand who are involved in these international projects too. So I'll focus on this generative stuff. So what's the issue here? The issue is this. I hope everyone agrees with this. AI-generated content is easy to produce, and it's going to be everywhere very soon. All the main software systems are basically pushing this technology almost like drug pushers on ordinary users to say, you can easily go into Microsoft Word or Acrobat Reader and just get it to generate a summary for you. And so there's going to be this stuff all over, and it's going to be like, in social media, which is where our sort of main interest is, but it's also going to be elsewhere on the internet, and it's going to be elsewhere, like in commerce and in education, and it's going to be in the traditional media too. We've already seen bits of AI content sneak into those for it. So it's going to be all those places. What do we do about that? Just some examples. So here are some political ones, just to make the point that these things are sort of potentially destabilizing. So this is from a while back, just faked audio in this case, that went out to quite a few people in New Hampshire in the Democratic primary. Recently, there was also fake images of Trump surrounded by adoring Black voters. And then here's one. I'm just back from the UK, and so I was thinking about the election. This is not a deep fake. This is actually a real photograph, but the candidate in this case used some photoshopping techniques to airbrush it. But there's a new question that now arises, like, is this real or is this not real? He looks kind of unreal. So what's going on? And so we're drawn to question everything we see these days. And I guess that's the new problem that we face at the moment. We have this new sort of authenticity problem or attribution problem. What's made by a machine and what's real? So I hope that makes sense. And that's what I'll be talking about. So just to kind of further sort of specify a little bit, there are 2 interesting cases to distinguish, and I'll just focus on one of them. One of them is where you're directly interacting with an AI, for instance, with a chatbot or with ChatGPT or with an avatar or something like that. In those cases, you can arrange for disclosure basically at the moment of interaction. So you can say you're just about to see an AI system, or you might have the AI person say, don't forget, I'm an AI, I'm not real, something like that. And you can do that. So enforcing transparency here can be done directly on the providers of the AI interaction system. But there's another case, which is indirect, where an AI produces a piece of content, and that piece of content then floats out. It could be anywhere on the internet or beyond, actually. It could end up in, on a piece of paper, or in a newspaper, or on TV, or whatever. So transparency here, or disclosure here, has to involve properties of the content itself. It can't go to do with the sort of system that's doing the work in producing the content, because by the time you see it, you're not engaging with that system anymore. And you can't just stick a label on it, because those labels can be removed. It's very easy to do. And if people wanted to sort of hide the fact that it was AI generated, and there would be such people, they could just take the label off. So we want something more resilient than that. So I'll be focusing on this second case here, this indirect interaction case. So why do you need to be able to identify that indirect AI generated content? And I suppose that's a question we're only recently asking ourselves this question. I don't have any concrete answers, but I think it's a very interdisciplinary endeavor to try and come up with an answer. Is it okay? When's it okay? When's it not right? If it's not right, what are the reasons it's not right? Some deep thinking needs to happen there. So certainly AI content isn't always worse than human content. I think it can be terrible human content, and some AI generated content can be very good. So you can't just go on quality. So the main reason that we've come up with in our group, and we've been thinking about this for a while, is just that AI content as a new sort of possibility changes the social context in some ways. But this feels to me like territory where a computer scientist like me is not necessarily best placed to do this work. This is something which might involve people working in schools of policy or politics, or elsewhere in social science, or in philosophy, actually, for that matter. Anyway, we have two arguments, and they're not technical at all. They're just to do with those other areas of social science. So one of them is to do with scale, and the idea there is that individuals can generate much more content using a content generator, which means that if they're not well-intentioned, they could threaten ecosystems of information more easily than hitherto. So that I'll spell that out a little bit more later. So that's one argument. And another one kind of goes to accountability. But again, I'm very open to other ideas here. I'm always interested to hear what other people think about here. But the basic idea here is that AI-generated content in some ways undermines the accountability of human organizations, or actually of individuals. So this could be commercial, so it could be organizations which are companies, or it could be organizations which are universities. And we might need new institutions to sort of safeguard accountability and safeguard the reputation of individuals as content providers, or individuals as institutions as content providers. So I'll try and unpacking that just a little bit. And again, this feels like part of this interdisciplinary job that's not really a technical thing at all. So in our societies, we communicate in large groups and in large contexts through the creation of enduring content. We put documents out, we create written music, or we make movies, or we have documentaries. All of those things are communication between humans through the creation of enduring content that sits in a library on the internet or something. And that's fundamental to the way our society works. It's part of the way it works. So for instance, in our whole news infrastructure, we rely on enduring content, whether it's newspapers or TV programs and so on. And in commerce, we have all sorts of enduring content that goes out in relation to marketing, or in relation to contracts drawn up between different players. All those things are written down, essentially. And we have principles for knowing that what's written down is, can be trusted. In education, that's the case that we know best. We get written content from students, and we produce written content for students. In each case, that's a fundamental part of the way we have worked as universities over the last, 1,000 years. So societies have developed, like we always do, in order to sort of keep stable. We've developed institutions that let citizens trust enduring content and certify people and organizations as good providers of content. So for journalism, for instance, as soon as there were pamphlets back in the whatever 1600s or whatever, immediately there were libel laws, and then when newspapers arose, or when broadcasting started, there were broadcasting standards and broadcasting codes and so on. In commerce, we've had things like contract law, we've had laws that govern abbots and stuff like that. There's also the free market can do some of this work. It doesn't have to be a law. It could just be the free market that says, I trust you because you have been reputable in the past. Educational institutions like schools and us, universities, certify people as reliable content providers by giving them a degree or a certificate. So we know, for instance, someone coming out with a medical degree is a competent person to provide medical advice, and same with law and so on. Or this degree lets you teach and so on. So all of those things are just institutions that let citizens trust individuals as providers of content. But AI-generated content in this argument here lets us escape the current institutions, and they potentially need to be extended a bit. That's our argument, in order to reintroduce kind of resilience or sort of stability. So I'll just go through the two arguments in a tiny bit more detail. So the scale one is relatively unproblematic, at least in the discussions I've had so far, but please feel free to say otherwise. So the basic idea is that individuals can produce more content. It's easier for an individual to destabilize an information ecosystem. So the bar is lower basically for individuals with AI in producing content, both in terms of quantity, they can produce more, and quality, they can produce better stuff than they would be able to produce otherwise, because you can produce rather convincing stuff very quickly with generative AI. So what that means is that an individual could impersonate many people, for instance, and then those impersonated individuals can act collectively in service of a single goal, for instance, from one person, or equally plausibly from one organization. So, for instance, a troll factory in some other country might be able to ramp up their operation. But this could also be something true about political parties if they were being unscrupulous, or pressure groups, or companies if they were being unscrupulous as well. So yeah, there's threats to news reporting and more fundamentally to democratic processes in our countries and to the free market and the way it works. So the other argument is accountability. So here the idea is that an individual at the moment, or an organization, is accountable for the content that they produce. But now an individual can produce content they don't know very much about just by writing a little prompt and asking GPT to sort of do the rest. And at that point, they may read it and understand it, but there's no guarantee that they did. They might not even have looked at it. So you lose this connection between an individual and the content that they provide. So that might be the case for a student who just did their essay with GPT. It might be the case for an employee in a company who wrote their report using GPT. You've lost that sort of trust that we normally have, because we know the only person who can produce, I mean, there may be someone who did it for them, but that's a small problem. It's a large problem we know about, in universities, but it's small compared to this new problem where everyone has access to GPT. Of course, caveat, AI content generation can be well used, can be a great tool, but the way we assess a piece of content may be different if we know it was AI generated. So, I reckon that we'd have different questions for the human provider, just to make sure that they're connected, this piece of content they produced. Are they sort of like in the loop on the production of this content? So I'll look at educational and professional context separately. In education, that's the case that is of most interest to us, potentially in terms of our own operations. So teachers assess content that's created by students, and teachers' task is to teach students about some topic and then to assess their students' learning. And often, traditionally, that often involves asking them to write something. So one thing you can do if you don't want to allow the possibility of AI-generated content is just to stop assessing writing altogether. That, I hope you would agree, is a pretty radical idea. We've been doing it that way, like I say, for 1,000 years or more. So just to throw that out because in the last year something else has come along seems to be rash. And in any case, to me, it feels like the production of written content is a really important part of learning. And again, I'd be interested in your thoughts here as university people. So here's something I've canvassed with lots of teachers, both in universities and in schools, including primary schools. Maybe learning to write is helpful in learning to think. So to spell that out a little bit, writing is a little harder than reading. And maybe when you're formulating thoughts, it's important to have this external representation sitting there that you write like a scratch pad. It's like an extension of your working memory, really. And learning how to use that extension of your working memory, a page where you can write things and change things and switch things around. Maybe that's an important part of what we call thinking these days, or at least some forms of thinking. So if that's the case, then AI content generation creates problems because potentially it allows us to not have to do that and not teach thinking in the proper way. And I just wanted to make one caveat there that came up in a discussion I had yesterday with someone, a colleague in my department here. Not all thinking involves writing, and he mentioned that the case of dyslexia. So there are people who've got dyslexia who can't learn this way, but they still manage to learn, and we effectively can teach them. So I don't want to say that this is the only way of teaching thinking, but nonetheless, it's something we do a lot, and it seems very radical to throw it out. So that's the argument for why we would like to have something that could reliably detect AI-generated content to allow us to retain this written form of assessing student learning. And the same in professional life, I would think. So here I'm a bit less confident, but see what you think. So organizations and employees in an economic context or a professional context, it might be lawyers or medical doctors or something like that, they have reputations as providers of good content, and AI content generation could threaten those reputations. So in those cases, the consumers of the content aren't like university teachers. They're not trying to test the providers to see how well they know this stuff. The whole point is that they're not able to assess because they're asking for these professional services from people who know more. So they're not experts, and so they can't do that trick of assessing. But nonetheless, content generation that happens automatically still kind of threatens the relationship between a human professional that says, here's a piece of advice or a piece of information, and the actual information itself. And so if I'm a consumer, it's like, one thing is to look at the content, but another thing is to look at the person who gave me that content. If I'm going to interact with them or discuss with them, I'd like to know that they knew the content too. And there again, you'd like to have something that which tells you, is this an AI-generated content or did a person write it? So I'm not so sure about this, but potentially if you want to retain a role for human professionals, then AI content generation creates problems. And again, we would like to have a detection tool if possible. So now I'll move to thinking about these detection tools. One final point before I pass on to the sort of technical side. So this is very much in the domain of social science, and you might have come across Yuval Harari talking about generative AI. He says this, which I think is a really good point. Text and images and sound, enduring content, is the stuff that human culture is made of. And AI systems that can generate that sort of content, quote, have hacked the operating system of our civilization. And I don't know about, that's a rather sort of dramatic way of talking about it, but AI systems are certainly intervening in some of the processes that structure and organize our societies. And that does seem like a problem that we'd like to solve if possible. And the solution is to know about what is AI generated and what's not. And a tool to do that is what I'll talk about next. So yeah, how do you address this problem? So what we'd like is to have an extension of the existing institutions for preserving trust in people and institutions. Not, there are already many of these institutions, and I'm just talking about an extension to them, adding something basically, which is adding a suite of tools that can reliably identify AI-generated content. So there are also, these things sort of like just add to the collection of institutions that we have for keeping our society safe. So what would these tools do? Well, they would guide people when they look at something. So when a teacher looks at an essay, they could check whether it was made by a machine or that. Most of the teachers that I've talked to would like to have that ability if the system was reliable. But you can imagine also using it in business or in government. But they would also, the same tools would also guide not only individuals, but also institutions, like, for instance, social media platforms, whose job is to disseminate content. So if you are scanning for AI-generated content, that might change how you disseminate stuff. For instance, if you find lots of AI-generated content coming from one particular place, you might suspect that there's something going on and not disseminate it or have a closer look. So it would also guide at a much higher level whole institutions like, Google or Facebook and things like that. But the rub here is that automated AI content detectors are hard to build if you want them to be reliable. And if they're not reliable, you really don't want to use them because they make all sorts of errors which are problematic. Like, you don't want to tell a student your thing was AI generated when it wasn't. So they have to work. And this problem is getting tougher and tougher because the content the generators themselves are getting better and better. And we argue in our group that if you're just in the business of looking at the content, for instance, analyzing an image or looking at a text, it's basically going to be impossible pretty soon to distinguish AI generated and natural content because generators are improving at leaps and bounds. And if you ever have a difference between an AI generated thing and a natural thing, that's an error term that AI learning algorithms can immediately address to reduce. So this problem is going to get very hard, we suggest impossible, as AI generators get better. So here's our proposal. Our suggestion at the Global Partnership on AI in our social media governance group is that the only way to deliver reliable detectors is by putting responsibility for detection with the providers of the AI generators. So that means in practice with the big AI companies. For instance, OpenAI, who are responsible for ChatGPT, or Anthropic, who produce Claude, or so on. So again, I'll try and just justify that with two different reasons why responsibility should lie with the producers of generators. The first thing is that the providers of a generator, like OpenAI, can instrument their generators specifically to support detection. So you may have come across this notion of watermarking, where the generator is kind of like set up to stick a watermark which can't be seen by humans, but nonetheless can be picked up by a detection tool in the content that they produce. And that's relatively straightforward to do for images or videos or audio, actually. In text, there's not so much information. It's a bit harder to hide watermarks, but you could do something. But there's another way you can do this, which is actually arguably better and hasn't been discussed nearly as much. So you might not have heard about this. So I'll mention it. So another way you can build a detection tool is, if you're the AI provider, if you're OpenAI, let's say, you can just log all of the content that you generate in a private escrow log, and then you can implement a detection tool for the stuff that you generated simply as a plagiarism detector on that private log. So a plagiarism detector is just something that queries, is this document here one of the things that you've got in your log? That task is just information retrieval. It's what Google does. It's what Google's been doing for 30 years. The big companies, who produce the generators are the absolute world masters in information retrieval of that sort. And so they could readily do this, we suggest, and this needs to be talked about more. But there's a second reason, and I think this is even more compelling, actually. So a detection tool, if it's going to be kind of plausible, has to distinguish different levels of human involvement in generated content. So for instance, generating a document from scratch is very different from just having a generator. You give an existing document as a prompt, for instance, ChatGPT, and say, oh, could you tidy up this essay and kind of like, fix some stylistic problems? Those are completely different things. And in one case, the student, let's say it's a student, one case, the student really has made it up and hasn't had any involvement. In the other case, they've had a lot of involvement and the AI system is just doing a little piece at the end. So those are two very different tasks, but you end up with an AI-generated text in both cases. And here's the rub, right? Companies are the only ones who can tell the difference between those two cases because they're the only ones who are party to the prompt. They're literally, the prompt is secret to the company. No one else knows that. So the company is the only one that can do this work in deciding, have you just tweaked, is the AI system just tweaked the material that's provided in the prompt, or has it generated some content from whole cloth, from scratch? Anyway, those, I think, are good reasons why a responsibility would be with providers. So here's our specific proposal that we made, and we've written this up in a couple of papers. The company developing an AI generation system must demonstrate a reliable detection tool for the content that their system generates as a condition of into public release. So that got a lot of attention from policymakers, and actually it got incorporated, not quite in those words, into the EU's AI Act, which was approved a couple of months ago. And that was a real result, I think. It probably also had an impact on Joe Biden's executive order on AI that happened last year. And that probably came about because two of our co-authors are sort of famous AI people who were invited to a Senate Judiciary hearing on AI to give evidence about generative AI safety. And that hearing was one of the processes and discussions that fed into Biden's executive order. So this has had some impact, basically. So I thought I'd just, again, this is like now going out of my home territory of AI into what's straight law, basically. This is like tech law or something like that. So we've had a lot of interaction with the EU parliamentarians who drafted the AI Act, especially the amendments for generative AI, which, as you might know, kept the AI Act on ice for about an extra year. But Article 52 does more or less do what we're suggesting. So there's various caveats, and I'll mention them. But the important thing to note here is that you need people who know about technical AI methods, but you also need people who know about formulation of law and drafting of laws and so on. So it really is very interdisciplinary, and not in the it's new combinations of disciplines, arguably, which are relevant here. So just very briefly, this is some more legal stuff from that AI Act. One of the conditions that's put on those obligations on companies is technical feasibility. So there's a reference to the current state of the art. So if there are ways of evading detection that current technologies can't counter, because there's going to be an arms race between the people who are building AI detection tools and those who are seeking to evade a detection. So companies aren't required to do the impossible, basically. On the other hand, if within that arms race, there are known ways of responding to evasion methods that are out there, companies can't ignore those either. So it sort of goes both ways. There's also a reference to technical standards, because technical standards are where you're going to find the current state of the art, I suppose. And that often happens to tech legislation, as we've learned. Another of the conditions is to do with costs. The methods that companies are required to use to support detection tools can't be arbitrarily expensive, but exactly what that means is still to be worked out. So the AI Act, like lots of bits of tech legislation, is really the start of a conversation rather than the end of one. I'll just finish, so we've got some time to discuss. So the scenario that I want to think about, and this is what we're thinking about most recently in our group in this area, is imagine that you did have a reliable AI content detector. We don't have them yet, right? We really don't. There are various companies that provide them, but none of them are really very good because they're all working externally to companies. They're not using company internal methods. If we did have a reliable one, what would we do with it? So for instance, a university, would it naturally, for instance, would the free market be sufficient just to ensure that all universities and all schools started to use these tools when it was appropriate? Or, and that may be true in some cases, both in for instance, education and maybe also in commerce, maybe even in journalism. But are there certain actors that would need to be obliged to use these tools to scan systematically, methodically for AI-generated content, and maybe new rules that require them to respond in certain ways to AI-generated content? So we don't have answers to those questions, but those are the questions we're currently asking. That's it. So happy to have any questions, both about the specific stuff to do with AI-generated content, but also to do with those more general questions about how New Zealand universities could collaborate, particularly in offering advice to the New Zealand government about how it should use AI or how it could use AI.
Kia ora, Ali. Thank you very much. What a fantastic overview, and thank you for taking us so thoughtfully through those key issues, and also challenging us with some questions that many of us have been discussing, I think, within our universities and also collectively. I wonder if you could just stop screen sharing, and then we can Yep, there we go. It's probably easier for me to see if people have got questions. If you've got a question, colleagues, artificial hand, real hand, or pop something in the chat.
Don't let me down, Vice Chancellors.
Look, I can jump in, Ali. You know, I'm just thinking about the, you know, one of the sort of issues that's hot to trot in our sector here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is around data sovereignty, and particularly Māori data sovereignty. You know, that is raised in any kind of policy discussion. Can you just talk a little bit about, you know, the role that plays in terms of the conversations that you may be having in terms of our government here in Aotearoa? I suspect that's a slightly different discussion to international considerations of this.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a huge question. So as quite often in discussions of AI, it's quite useful to distinguish the old AI, the traditional AI that was around, you know, until a couple of years ago, from the new generative AI. And I often do that. So when it comes to the old AI, those are more or less, you know, just to sort of say it sort of rather crudely, to build a system that learns how to map X onto Y by giving examples of X and Y. And that technology has been around, you know, ever since statistics, basically, but there are lots of AI systems that do similar things. And there are many systems like that in use in AI in the New Zealand government, or more broadly in the New Zealand commerce. For instance, systems that predict how good you are for a loan, or predict whether you have skin cancer from a picture of a mole or something like that. And in those cases, the issues are to do with, for Maori, how willing they are to share their data in the training sets for these algorithms. And we had lots of discussion about this in that report that we recently did on AI in healthcare in New Zealand. And there was a lot of talk about what the right units were. So there was individuals saying, I'd like to share my data. And there was also maybe a hapu or an iwi that might say, I'm willing to share it within my iwi, but not beyond. Or maybe I could share it within New Zealand, but not beyond the shores of New Zealand. So those questions are raised in that context. In the context of AI, of generative AI, another big question is to do with what rights companies in Silicon Valley essentially have to just trawl the internet in New Zealand for Maori language text, for Maori language data, and build a language model that can speak Maori without any recompense to the Maori community here. And in that context, we've had some very interesting discussions, very preliminary, I must say, with Maori IP lawyers here in Wellington, in particular, Linnell Tufrihuria, who's worked a lot on collective IP for Maori in issues relating to, for instance, visual trademarks, or even words that have been used in companies as trademarks. And she's had some success in her company at litigating those. And if you think that languages, that the Maori language is understood in New Zealand as being a taonga, then there's a very interesting case to be made that the Maori community has a collective ownership over all the texts in New Zealand that are scraped by these big language systems. And it's much easier to identify an owner if it's a group like that. It's very difficult to identify an individual like John Grisham or something like that, because when an AI system generates text, well, what it produces is partly Grisham and partly me and partly you and partly everyone else. But if it produces Maori sentence, you know for damn sure that it got the information to do that from collectively the Maori text in New Zealand, and therefore maybe there's some collective ownership in that case. So again, it's useful to distinguish between predictive AI models, the traditional models, and then these more recent generative AI models. But in both cases, I think data sovereignty questions really rise.
Kia ora. Thanks, Ali. That's really helpful. Kia ora, Richard.
Kia ora, Ali. Good to see you, mate.
Yes.
Leading on from that, hopefully, Do you know what work is being done in terms of sort of voluntary standards for disclosure? And it could be through copyright or Creative Commons type licensing to have content creators mark their content with machine assistance. And again, machine assistance is not new. Maps and designs and other things will have had computer assistance on them since computers were a cowboy, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure about the voluntary case, but I can speak to the AI Act, the EU's AI Act. They're imposing some much stronger rules, which will come into force, actually not in any immediate time. It's going to be 3 years before these ones come in, but rules that require the providers of the very large foundation models, as they're called in the AI Act, to say something about where they got their data from. So there's going to be more transparency, quite a lot more transparency in that case. So what companies are going to have to be doing now is working through what that means exactly with EU executives, so that when these conditions come into force, they'll be within the law, because the EU AI Act, like all of these EU tech rules, is really quite binding. There's high fines if you are found to be non-compliant, like 7% of gross annual revenue, global revenue. So they're going to do this. And so companies are highly motivated by this. And just on that same point, in relation to voluntary versus kind of legal or obligatory, black letter, in our group at GPay, we tried working in voluntary collaborations with companies, and we found basically that we couldn't get anything done. So for instance, on that recommender algorithm stuff where we were asking for A/B test access, we got a certain distance with Twitter, and then Elon Musk took over and sacked everyone in Twitter that we were working with. So we basically pivoted away from voluntary schemes towards black letter law schemes. And there's various things around the world, but the EU is certainly in the forefront. So the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act and the EU's AI Act are the kind of front runners in attempts to sort of properly sort of like legislate for these big systems.
Thanks.
Thanks, Sally. Colleagues, thoughts, questions? I've got another one that I'm happy to jump in, but I don't want to monopolise the conversation today, because I know that there will be many questions that you have. Kia ora, Stuart.
Thanks, Sally. Great presentation. Listen, as I'm sort of grappling with how to have policy across the university around learning and teaching in AI, there are a number of issues we need to get our heads around. One is how to be confident in the content we source. That's one question. But another set of questions is around academic integrity of our students. And as everyone across the university is concerned about this, there are kind of two schools of thought that I see among our staff. One school of thought is, well, right now we can't trust our AI detection tools yet. So what should we do? We should stop our students, having access to AI at all. So we need to lock them up. We need to take away computers. We need to, cut out access and all of those sorts of things and do it that way. The other school of thought is around, one I find myself more sympathetic to, is trying to change our pedagogy and design our assessment tasks to actually facilitate them using the AI, but use it as an opportunity to think through how they critically engage with that AI and maybe do things that wouldn't be helped by those AI tools. I'm just wondering if you've thought through what we should be doing in the education space right now.
Yeah, so I've definitely encountered both of those two positions, and it's a really interesting debate. I don't think that this debate is finished by any means. I think it's a great one for us to kind of keep at. I would say that on the second of those strategies, I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I mean, we've been using assessment through written content forever, and it's an amazing. It's like a fairly integral part of how assessment is done in schools and universities, and it's an incredibly radical thing to decide that we don't need it anymore. And I know that there are some people, in particular in the educational theory side, who have had problems with written assessment for a long time, who are very happy that that AI is now providing an extra reason to look elsewhere. And I do think we should look elsewhere. I think there are amazing educational tools that we can create with AI. There's no question about that. So I don't want to say that that we shouldn't be doing that. But I think we might also need to preserve this older technique that we've had forever, because I do have a feeling that it's quite important in forming people's ability to think in a structured way. So yeah, I think we don't want to sort of pivot too drastically towards methods that only use the new methods, because everything is so new. It's like it's untested, untried. We don't yet know much about it. And so I want to be a bit conservative, actually. I find myself being a bit of a fuddy-duddy in relation to these assessment practices. So, but it's an interesting conversation to have.
Kia ora, thanks, Ali. I can see that Mark has a question. Kia ora, Mark. Finding your off mute button. Yep. Taihoa, he says. There we go.
Kia ora. Sorry, my trackpad was misbehaving for a second there and I couldn't get it to go to the mute button. Thanks, Ali. What a fascinating webinar, and really intellectually stimulating. So thank you very much. I'm really interested in sort of some of the ethical dilemmas that this poses for us all. And I'm not just thinking about universities here, I think for probably humanity, but in our context for universities. And are there, in your view, some sort of fundamental ethical principles that we might use as foundations for developing how we should respond? Because as you pointed out, this is both an opportunity and a challenge or a threat. And as generative AI continues to develop and refine itself and have multiple applications that we cannot yet anticipate, something that we might develop now as a legal response or requirement is likely to be obsolete in a very short period of time. So I'm just wondering about, are there some fundamentals that we might, as a university sector, land on that we could use as our basis for our responses to generative AI, and, as I say, recognizing both the opportunities and the challenges that it provides? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. So in relation to AI more generally, there's certainly many principles of AI ethics. So for instance, principles that sort of advocate for transparency, for accountability, for lack of bias, for human control and oversight, for beneficence and non-maleficence. So there are many sets of principles of that sort. But I think you're asking a newer question, which is, are there any principles that would govern how generative AI is used specifically, for instance, within education? And actually there, I don't know. And you're quite right, by the way, to say that this stuff is changing fast. And when you formulate law, you've got this difficult question with any law for new technologies as to whether you try and anticipate the technology or legislate retrospectively after the technology has already arrived. And it's very useful to work with tech lawyers, and we certainly do work with tech lawyers in our group to think about those questions. But I think that I don't think there are principles specifically about how institutions can adopt generative AI. The closest I can think is that if you're going to use generative AI, you better evaluate it really thoroughly, because it can make horrible mistakes. And so the testing of it, the evaluation to see whether it actually works the way that it's supposed to work, is very important. I think that's the best general principle that I can think of right now.
Thanks, Ali. That's a great question to really complex set of issues, I think. Colleagues, we've got about 3 minutes left. So, Margaret, I'll go to you now, Ihua.
Thanks. And it's a longer question and kind of a vague one because it's just forming in my head. But I'm thinking about AI as it applies to research. So we often think about it in the academic domain for students. And yes, of course, you know, the issues about AI generated papers and AI generated images and so on. But I guess but I also know there's opportunities in using AI to kind of stretch our thinking and, you know, help us design new experiments that we hadn't otherwise, you know, conceived of. And I guess I'm just interested in how much you or your group or others have thought about how we should be thinking about what are the opportunities and challenges specific to research beyond those of just generating a paper or generating data.
Yeah, great question. So for one thing, this is something I came across recently, a study which looked at publicly available reviews of conference articles that have been submitted. Sometimes conference articles have this open review process where the reviews are made public, and you can take those reviews collectively and put them through whatever AI content detector things we have now. And they found some very interesting things. So, for instance, reviews that were submitted close to the deadline, more likely to be AI generated, and people who'd submitted AI-generated reviews were less likely to participate in rebuttals, and they were also more likely to self-assess themselves as less of experts. So all of those things are kind of worrying signals. But there's no doubt that AI is going to be very useful in research too. I think the key question for us, or the key imperative for us, is to work out how we make sure that human researchers stay in the loop. And again, I can't help but think that reliable AI content detection tools will help us assess that one way or another. It's not to say that you can't use AI content generation, but we need to know what's what. So yeah.
Kia ora, Ali, thanks. It's a great point on which to end. And just before I quickly wrap up, Bronwyn, I'll hand over to you. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you, Giselle. Ali, I just wanted to say thank you on behalf of Universities New Zealand Te Pōkaitāra for presenting to us this afternoon. And actually, it's the second presentation you've done for Universities New Zealand. The first was in front of members of Parliament back in March at our Speaker Science Forum. So I just wanted to say thank you on behalf of UNZ.
Thank you. Thanks for your questions.
Kia ora, Bronwyn. And look, Ali, just falls to me as chair of this session to thank you very much for a fascinating and utterly thought-provoking presentation. I just want to call out one of the things that you talked about, you know, creativity, and add another concept there, struggle, or go to one of my favourite artists, the great Nick Cave. When ChatGPT was released, you know, he famously said that it rejected that there is a collective, essential and unconscious human spirit underpinning our existence, connecting us all through mutual striving. That idea of struggle, I think, is something that I think about in relation to creativity. But look, thank you very much for giving of your time today, especially considering that you've just arrived back from Europe last night. And a huge thanks to Bronwyn, to Therese, to Judy and to Rochelle for organising today's event. Thank you all for your engagement, colleagues. I'll just close with a karakia. Unahia, 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 ki te uru tapanui, kia wātia, kia māma, te nākau, te tinana, te wairua i te aratakata, koe rā rongo whakāria ake ki runga, ka tina tina, hui e, tai ki e. Thank you, everyone.
Kia ora. Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Giselle.
Kia ora.
Thanks.